today, why is it that 50 years after it happened, so many people think the moon landing is a hoax? And that night in the Guardian's offices as they race to cover one of the biggest stories of the century.
Two, 1, 0, all engine running.
When the Apollo 11 spaceflight blasted off from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida 50 years ago this week, it resulted in perhaps the most iconic moment of the 20th century.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The statement by Neil Armstrong in the early hours of the 21st of July, 1969, marked the moment that he and then Buzz Aldrin set foot onto the moon.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
NASA had the forethought to attach a camera to the ladder on the lunar module itself.
I'm at the foot of the ladder.
So once Neil Armstrong had unfolded it, it could actually capture him coming down. That's one of the first things that the conspiracy theorists picked up on is, if he's landed on the moon, how come there was someone there to film him?
The grainy footage broadcast from that camera mounted on the ladder was watched live across the world by 600 million people. But in the years to come, many would start to believe that it was all a hoax. From The Guardian, I'm Anushka Astana. Today in Focus, why does the moon landing conspiracy still endure today?
There were 6 alleged moon landings between 1969 and 1972, and there's been 0 moon landings since. Seems a little suspicious, doesn't it? Well, that's because we never went to the moon.
So there are a number of perennials, if you like, that people point to again and again, and it doesn't seem to matter how many times these things are patiently explained. These things crop up.
Richard Godwin is a freelance journalist who writes for The Guardian.
One is the shadows. So people point out that, the shadows don't all fall in exactly the same direction.
Not to mention photos where the astronauts are backlit by the sun, yet you can still see the detail on front of the astronauts. #studio lighting.
This proves that it was staged in some kind of sound stage and there was artificial lighting. Actually, the moon dust has certain reflective qualities. There are multiple light sources because there was the sunlight bouncing off the moon and then also bouncing off the Earth too and reflecting off the lunar module itself. There's an idea that the flag was fluttering. And how could the flag flutter? Because there's no atmosphere on the moon.
There's no wind on the moon, Einstein.
Actually, if you go back and look at the footage, the flag is sort of on a crossbar thing so that it actually folds down and you can see the stars and stripes. And it does slightly wobble when they hammer it into the moon's surface, which they had quite a lot of difficulty doing. But it's not sort of floating in the breeze. Another thing that the conspiracists tend to point to is that there's no blast crater underneath the lunar module. So, how could it have possibly come into land?
This would be approximately like diving into a swimming pool in your car and not making a splash.
Well, actually, it's sort of helicoptering down in 1/6 gravity again. So by the time it got close to the moon's surface, there wasn't much of a blast. And moon dust behaves rather differently in a vacuum.
No stars in any photos. I don't know. I'm just asking questions here.
What about the lack of stars?
The lack of stars. Suspicious, huh? I don't know if you've ever taken a picture of the night sky, but you don't tend to pick up stars because you need a very long exposure time to pick up light that's coming from that far away. The moon landing took place also in the lunar daytime. They would have been more visible on the dark side of the moon if you had a much longer exposure time.
Where did the idea that the moon landing was a hoax begin?
Well, there were always doubts attendant on the whole thing, based on the whole Cold Wariness of the space race. Obviously, the US was locked in a existential struggle with the USSR. The person that really gets this going is a guy called Bill Kaysing, who briefly, well, for a while, he worked as a chief technical writer of a company that helped supply rocketry equipment for NASA.
Talk to me whenever you're ready.
Okay. My name is Bill Kaysing, and I essentially had a conventional life until, let's say, I left the aerospace industry.
And he published in 1976 a book called We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle.
And I began getting telephone calls from all over the United States wanting interviews.
And it was he, the one who established the question marks over things like the shadows and the blast crater.
Having seen hundreds of rocket firings when I was employed by Rocketdyne, I know that the jet of the lunar module lander, the lunar lander, would have created an enormous crater.
And he claims to have spoken to NASA insiders who said that there was just absolutely no way that Americans could get to the moon. And he cited a number of bits of evidence as he saw it. One was that the Russians had all the space firsts up until then, pretty much, and NASA was way behind.
Apollo astronauts Roger Chaffee, Edward White, and Gus Grissom lose their lives in a tragic flash fire aboard their grounded space capsule.
There had been Apollo 1 had ended in a launch pad fire that killed the 3 astronauts, and he just couldn't get his hand around the idea that they could have turned things around so quickly and actually pulled off the seemingly impossible.
Given the job that he'd had, there was a certain plausibility. I mean, he had been right there.
The thing was, Bill Kaysing wasn't exactly right there. There were 400,000 people in total who had some part in the Apollo missions. So that's 399,999 people versus one guy who worked not in a technical capacity exactly, but in a sort of more of a communications position for one subsidiary company. So, whether he's more credible than a Buzz Aldrin or Neil Armstrong, I'm not too sure about that.
What was going on at that time that meant this conspiracy theory took hold?
After the optimism of the 1960s, you had a period of enormous paranoia and mistrust in the government. You had Vietnam, you had Nixon, Watergate, you had the Pentagon Papers, and the idea that you were being lied to is all over all the movies and all the TV of that era and begins to settle somewhere deep in the American psyche.
Here, in the continuing race for the moon with the United States of America, the Soviet Union launched Valery Bykovsky and Valentina Tereshkova. In utmost secrecy, only the military and technicians observed the launchings of the 2 new cosmonauts.
And obviously this was a high-stakes Cold War existential game of survival versus the Soviet Union, but actually, contra the whole narrative that it was a big part of some war game, the American astronauts and the Soviet cosmonauts had met each other at various air shows over the world, and they actually had quite a lot in common, and the Russian space agency were all spying on them and listening in. And according to Alexei Leonov, who was first Russian to do a spacewalk, they were cheering on, and they really wanted them to do it.
And they presumably, if they were spying on them while cheering them on, were in a position to let us know if it was a hoax.
Absolutely, yeah. That's where the conspiracy really begins to come apart, because you have to say, okay, to believe this, you have to believe, first of all, that the American government could have lied through its teeth. But then you would have to believe that the Russians were also in on the conspiracy and lying through their teeth. Funnily enough, the conspiracists actually have an answer to that. They will say, well, the Russians knew that it was a fake, but they were blackmailing the US.
What were they getting in return for keeping secret the moon hoax?
Who knows?
And the hoax was fed by films at the time.
The first pop culture reference to it that seems to have had a wide audience, at least, is in Diamonds Are Forever.
Who are you?
My name is Bond. James Bond.
the Bond film which was made in 1971.
He's back in a new Bond spectacular.
There's a scene in that where Sean Connery is running away from some government operatives, and he flees a Las Vegas casino and somehow winds his way up into a NASA facility in the Nevada desert. And as he's kind of being chased, he walks onto a stage set where some astronauts are doing something that looks a bit suspicious on a moon set. And you can very much see the wooden stage scenery that Bond then hides behind.
There he is, behind the rock. Come on!
What the hell is this, amateur night? Stop him, Harry.
But on the film, it's not really explained. It doesn't really serve a narrative purpose other than to allow Bond to jump into a moon buggy and then make a dashing escape across the desert.
What's been fueling these beliefs in more recent times?
Tonight,
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
we investigate the most extraordinary event of the 20th century.
The moon hoaxism, if you like, died down until Fox News put on a documentary in 2001, which pretty much presented the whole hoax as if it were a fact.
Could the government have orchestrated the deception of the century?
NASA could have pulled off the greatest hoax of all time.
You be the judge.
And that really got the whole thing going again.
Did people believe it?
I spoke to a guy named Roger Launius, who is a chief historian for NASA at the time, and he said they were absolutely, after that documentary, they were inundated with phone calls, some from conspiracy theorists, but mostly from concerned parents and teachers because their kids had seen this stuff and were now asking them to explain how come they were being lied to.
How did NASA respond to the claims?
Well, actually, in 1977, NASA had put out a little leaflet debunking Casing's book, and they put it out again in 2001 after the conspiracy theory episode on Fox News.
And it once actually resulted in a punch-up.
Yes, one of the modern moon conspiracists is a man named Bart Sibrel, and he had a habit of collaring NASA operatives and telling them that they were liars and that they were cowards, and how dare they have done this.
Don't be shy.
Just come with me, Buzz.
You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself.
Away from me.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
Buzz Aldrin, who had rather a short temper, just lamped him in the end.
Buzz Aldrin felt that he had the proof.
Yeah. I think it's worth stressing that one of the reasons that this theory takes hold too is the fact that the moon landings never really went anywhere. They're not still happening. The last one happened in 1972.
And you know what? I have to say, I don't believe in the hoax, I promise. But I have to say, it is a bit weird how loads of people went to the moon and then no one else went again.
The people working on it at the time wouldn't have known that. They would have thought that this was the future, but it wasn't really the future.
Proud Americans and observers from all over the world gathered to watch Apollo 12 blast off on man's second voyage to the moon.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Launch commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff with Apollo 14. 3 minutes past the hour.